Over 2,700 years ago, 10 tribes of Israel vanished from history. Were they lost forever, or is their story still waiting to be uncovered? Join us as we follow the archaeological evidence, historical records, and biblical account in search of the truth. The year is 930 BC. A singular foundation cracks, and the kingdom of Israel fractures at the seams. What was once the house of David now buckles under the weight of internal division. The transition is not merely political, it is a violent rupture of collective identity. Stone by stone, the unified structure that defined a generation begins to pull apart. The northern tribes pull away from the south, leaving behind a silence that hangs heavy over the plains. There is no joy in this separation, only the cold, sharp realization that the golden age has reached its end. Borders are drawn in the dust. The map of the ancient world changes in a single stroke, leaving a legacy of uncertainty in its wake. Leaders scramble to secure what remains, while the populace looks toward an horizon that no longer feels like home. The unity of the past has dissolved, replaced by the grim reality of two nations standing in the shadow of their former selves. The era of one Israel is over. The age of the split has begun, and with it, the long, winding path toward an inevitable and historic unraveling. 10 tribes turn their backs on Jerusalem. The movement is swift, a sudden exodus of loyalty that leaves the southern throne isolated. They march north, not merely to distance themselves, but to redefine the very heart of their worship. In the shadow of the mountains, at Dan and Bethel, they raise new altars to mark their independence. This is more than a migration. It is the establishment of a rival state. The air in the north vibrates with the energy of a new beginning, yet it is built upon the ruins of a broken covenant. Every act of construction, every stone laid for these new sanctuaries, serves as a defiance of the old order. The rift deepens, pulling the landscape into two distinct, competing spheres. Lines of travel that once flowed toward a single center now divert, creating a complex web of borders and barriers. The northern tribes claim their land, their identity, and their destiny, casting off the yoke of the house of David. This separation is no longer a temporary dispute. It is a geopolitical reality, etched into the hills and valleys of the region. The kingdom is torn in two, and the world watches as a new, fractured map takes its place in history. The map is now set. To the north, the kingdom of Israel rises, anchored by its own sovereign ambitions. To the south, Judah clings to the ancestral seat of David. This is not a peaceful neighborly coexistence. It is a profound schism that echoes through every village and city. Each nation now demands exclusive loyalty, forcing the people to choose where their allegiance lies. The northern authorities move to consolidate their power, creating a new administrative framework that rejects the southern hierarchy entirely. Meanwhile, in Jerusalem, the southern leadership watches the north with calculated hostility, viewing the breakaway as a betrayal of the divine mandate. The religious authority that once unified the tribes is now a weapon, wielded by both sides to justify their existence. Pilgrimage routes that once brought people together now serve as checkpoints, where travelers are scrutinized for signs of northern or southern loyalty. The divide is no longer just a line on a map. It is a psychological and spiritual chasm. Every decree issued from the north and every counterclaim from the south deepens the enmity. This is the new status quo. Two nations, one history, and a rivalry that will define the survival of both kingdoms for generations to come. To secure the borders, the north requires a spiritual anchor. The king looks to the ancient sites of Dan and Bethel, transforming them from local shrines into the beating heart of a new national identity. He orders the construction of massive altars, visible for miles, drawing the people away from the traditional path to Jerusalem. This is a calculated disruption. By providing a closer, more accessible destination for sacrifice, he effectively severs the religious tether that binds the northern tribes to the southern capital. The air at these new centers is thick with the scent of incense and the anticipation of a people finding their own way. Merchants and pilgrims begin to bypass the old, established routes, creating new arteries of influence that feed the northern economy. The southern priests in Jerusalem watch the smoke rising from the north. With growing alarm, realizing that their monopoly on the divine has been shattered. This is a deliberate act of institutional defiance. Every prayer offered at these new sites is a vote for independence, a rejection of the House of David, and a solidification of the Northern Kingdom's own distinct destiny. The divide is now absolute, marked in stone and ritual, ensuring that the two nations will never again walk the same spiritual path. Decades pass, and the political rhetoric fades into the silent language of stone. Archaeology now pulls back the curtain on this era, matching the biblical claims of rapid expansion with physical proof. In the northern highlands, the earth reveals a sudden, frantic pace of development. Excavators brush away layers of silt to uncover bedrock foundations that suggest an organized, state-led push for infrastructure. These are not merely dwellings. They are the marks of a kingdom asserting its permanence in the Levant. We find the telltale signs of intense, coordinated labor, massive stone blocks precisely cut and laid in deep trenches to support administrative hubs. Every site tells the same story. A society rapidly shifting from agricultural clusters to a centralized, urbanized power. The stratigraphy confirms the timeline, showing a spike in building activity that mirrors the biblical records of the northern kings. Where the text speaks of authority, the ground provides the evidence of mortar, iron tools, and city planning. This is the tangible pulse of a kingdom in its prime. As the dust clears, the ruins stand as in silent witness, verifying the historical weight of the narrative and confirming that the North was indeed a formidable, growing reality upon the landscape. At the center of this burgeoning power, one name rises above the rest: Samaria. It is not just a city. It is a statement of intent carved into the limestone hills. The northern kings discard old, vulnerable settlements in favor of this elevated, defensible stronghold. The scale of the transformation is immediate. Engineers cut deep into the bedrock, creating platforms that defy the natural slope of the terrain. Massive fortification walls begin to climb toward the sky, constructed with precision-hewn stones that lock together with relentless strength. This is no longer a collection of tribes. It is a state commanding the landscape. Watchtowers emerge at the corners of the perimeter, casting long shadows over the surrounding valleys. Every meter of masonry serves as a warning to potential rivals and a sign of stability to the citizens within. The city grows in complexity, with internal support structures and sophisticated water management systems, ensuring that the capital can withstand long periods of isolation. From this height, the rulers of the north look out over their territory, their confidence etched into the very ramparts that guard the gates. Samaria is now the crown jewel, a physical manifestation of a kingdom that believes its walls are high enough to reach the clouds and strong enough to endure the tests of history. Inside these fortified walls, the austerity of the hilltop gives way to an atmosphere of profound indulgence. Beneath the layers of ash and sediment, archaeologists have unearthed the physical remnants of a lifestyle that once defined the northern elite. Tiny, intricate fragments of ivory, carved with the precision of master artisans, litter the floors of the palace chambers. These are not mere trinkets. They are the remains of elaborate furniture, headboards, and wall panels, inlaid with gold and exotic woods that once glittered in the dim light of the throne room. Each piece is carved with mythological figures and floral motifs, reflecting a taste for the foreign and the expensive. The craftsmanship is undeniable, revealing a court that sought to surround itself with the finest materials the ancient world could offer. As we brush away the dirt from a single, delicate plaque, the biblical accounts of the ivory house cease to be abstract metaphors. They become tangible, undeniable reality. This opulence was a deliberate signal of status, a display of wealth that stood in stark contrast to the surrounding poverty. Yet, in this silence of stone and bone, one can almost hear the shadow of the coming storm. The very objects that projected absolute power were also the focal points of a growing moral friction, marking the threshold where excess began to invite catastrophe. The silence of the palace chambers did not last. Beyond the gates, the air began to thicken with the voices of those who refused to celebrate the new opulence. These prophets walked the streets of Samaria, their presence a jarring intrusion into the refined calm of the elite. They pointed not to the walls, but to the people. They pointed to the ivory panels and called them tokens of injustice. The friction was immediate. While the rulers counted their gold and admired their imported cedar, the prophets spoke of a hollow foundation. They did not whisper. They stood in the busy marketplaces, their words cutting through the noise of trade, warning that the strength of the kingdom was being measured by the wrong standard. They saw the decay in the way the poor were treated, in the disregard for ancestral law, and in the blind reliance on material comfort. The abandonment of God's covenant agreement, a distant past. Every fine carving was to them a mark of spiritual fracture. The city grew louder, divided between the pride of its architectural achievement and the sharp, unrelenting critique of those who saw the coming collapse. The material beauty of the palace was no longer a symbol of status. It had become a target, a visible proof of the moral rot that the prophets claimed would pull the entire kingdom down from its mountain perch. While the prophets spoke of moral decay, the city itself hummed with a different kind of energy. Samaria had transformed into the beating heart of regional commerce. Caravans from the north, south, and east converged on its gates, bringing cedar, spices, and precious metals to be exchanged in the bustling bazaars. The kingdom sat at a strategic crossroads, and its rulers knew how to capitalize on every mile of road passing through their territory. Tolls were collected, markets flourished, and the state treasury swelled with the proceeds of international exchange. It was a golden age of logistics, where the wealth of distant empires flowed through Samaria like water. But this economic vitality came at a price. The very prosperity that made the kingdom a regional powerhouse also made it a beacon for those who watched from the borders. The glitter of gold and the abundance of resources were not hidden. They were displayed as proof of strength. This visibility turned the kingdom into a target. As the city grew richer, the distance between the security of its walls and the reality of the geopolitical landscape began to shrink. The merchant routes that once promised endless growth now served as the path for encroaching threats, as larger empires began to look toward the northern plains with hungry eyes. Inside the city, the prosperity did not reach everyone. A sharp divide cleaved the population, creating two distinct realities within the same walls. Those in the upper tiers of society lived in a separate world, defined by surplus and protected status. Below them, the commoners saw their land rights vanish, swallowed by the expansion of large estates. Debt became a chain that bound the small farmer to the wealthy landowner. Families that had worked the same soil for generations found themselves displaced, forced into the city as day laborers or indentured servants. The social fabric began to fray under the weight of this inequality. Where once there was a shared identity, now there was only resentment and the cold reality of exploitation. Access to justice became a commodity bought by the highest bidder, leaving the vulnerable with no recourse. The legal protections that held the people together were ignored, replaced by the whims of those who sat in the high seats of power. This internal friction was not a sudden explosion, but a slow, grinding process that eroded the foundation of the state. As the elite grew further removed from the struggles of the common people, the kingdom lost its ability to act as a unified body. The social structure, once a source of strength, was now the very point of failure that would leave the nation brittle in the face of coming challenges. The instability within required a distraction, and the royal court turned to the only tool left, the art of the deal. Survival became a frantic exercise in balancing shifting loyalties. Envoys traveled incessantly, carrying gifts of gold and promises of support to neighbors who were themselves hungry for dominance. Each treaty signed in the halls of Samaria offered a momentary reprieve, a thin shield against the growing shadows to the east. Yet, these agreements were never free. With every handshake, a piece of sovereignty was signed away. The kingdom found itself drawn deeper into regional power plays, forced to provide troops or trade concessions that left its own borders increasingly exposed. A pact made for security in the north necessitated an affront to a power in the south, creating a cycle of escalating commitments. The rulers were walking a tightrope, and the wind was picking up. By attempting to placate every rival, they inadvertently turned the nation into a chessboard for larger empires. The diplomatic maneuvering, designed to guarantee stability, had the opposite effect. It signaled weakness to those who were watching, making the kingdom appear as a prize waiting to be claimed rather than an ally to be respected. Every alliance was a knot that tightened, pulling the nation closer to a precipice from which there would be no simple retreat. While the court in Samaria debated trade routes and border treaties, the horizon began to shift. Far to the east, the Neo-Assyrian Empire was no longer a distant rumor whispered by merchants. It was a kinetic force in motion. The massive military apparatus began its slow, deliberate push westward, absorbing smaller states and leveling cities that resisted the march. In the palace, the atmosphere soured. The luxury that defined the elite, the ivory carvings, the fine wines, the tapestries suddenly felt fragile. Reports arrived on the desks of officials, detailing the systematic dismantling of neighboring kingdoms. The sheer scale of the advance was unprecedented. Scouts returned with accounts of endless columns of infantry and ironclad siege engines that moved with the precision of a clock. A heavy silence began to replace the usual courtly chatter. The giant was stirring, and its wake was already being felt. The sky over the northern kingdom seemed to darken, not with clouds, but with the weight of an inevitable collision. Every night, the guards on the walls looked east, watching for a dust cloud that would mark the end of their autonomy. The empire was coming, and for the first time, the leaders of Samaria realized that no amount of gold or clever diplomacy could stop the momentum of a war machine that viewed their existence as an obstacle to be cleared. The rot began at the center. Within the span of a single season, the crown changed hands 3 times through violence. Each coup left the throne blood-stained and the administration hollow. Officials fled their posts, taking records and keys, leaving the machinery of government to grind to a halt. In the barracks, soldiers stood idle, waiting for commands that never came, their loyalty fractured by rival factions claiming the right to lead. The palace, once a center of order, became a site of frantic, whispered betrayals. As the leadership consumed itself, the defensive walls were left undermanned and ignored. Gates were locked, yet the gatesmen had no instructions. And the storehouses were stripped to fund the next short-lived reign. The kingdom was not merely losing its edge, it was dismantling its own foundation from within. Messengers were intercepted, supply lines were severed by domestic disputes, and the communication between the capital and the border outposts withered into silence. The chaos created a vacuum that even the most inexperienced scout could recognize. It was a kingdom at war with itself, blind to the horizon, utterly unprepared for the storm that was gathering. The greatest threat arrived at the gates, not because the walls were weak, but because the men inside had stopped looking outward, their eyes fixed only on the next move in a desperate, suicidal game of power. The internal power struggle ended in the only way it could, with the total exhaustion of the state. It was in this hollow silence that the ground began to tremble. It started as a low-frequency hum, a vibration felt in the teeth before it was heard by the ears. Shalmaneser V had arrived. Thousands of heavy, iron-soled boots struck the earth in perfect, terrifying unison. The rhythmic thudding traveled through the limestone hills, a relentless, mechanical heartbeat that signaled the end of hesitation. There was no herald, no demand for surrender, only the steady, crushing cadence of an empire in motion. In the valleys leading to the capital, the dust rose in a solid wall, blotting out the sun and turning the afternoon into a bruised, gray twilight. Every step brought the sound closer, a metallic clatter of arms, and the heavy drag of siege machinery, cutting deep furrows into the road. The birds stopped singing. The wind itself seemed to hold its breath as the sheer mass of the Assyrian column filled the horizon. It was not an army of men, but a singular, unstoppable force of nature. The rhythmic thunder grew until it rattled the very stones of the city walls, an inescapable announcement that the time for negotiation had expired. The march had reached the threshold. The sound of the army reached the city walls, and the panic was instantaneous. People flooded the streets, moving toward the center, their faces pale and eyes fixed on the massive fortifications. Guards scrambled up the stone staircases, their weapons clattering against the masonry. The order was shouted down from the battlements, "Seal the gates." It took 6 men to heave the primary gate bar into its iron cradle. The wood groaned under the pressure of the mountain of earth piled against it. Outside, the rhythmic thud of the Assyrian advance stopped, replaced by the grating, metallic sound of siege engines being positioned in the dirt. Inside, the heavy bronze bolts slid home with a final, echoing clang that vibrated through every street. Silence followed, but it was not the silence of peace. It was the suffocating, trapped stillness of a tomb. Citizens stood in the shadow of the walls, looking up at the heights, waiting for the first arrows to fall. The horizon was gone, blocked by the massive stone barricades. The city was no longer a home, it was a cage. Every breath was now a calculation of survival. The last link to the outside world had been severed, and the empire waited just on the other side of the timber. The first week passed without an assault. The Assyrians did not charge the walls. They built around them. Shalmaneser V turned the landscape into a sprawling, permanent camp of leather tents and iron workshops. The city was not being stormed. It was being erased from the map through starvation. Inside, the initial terror gave way to a dull, rhythmic exhaustion. Water rations were cut by half on the 10th day. By the second month, the grain stores were strictly inventoried, with guards posted at every warehouse door. The sound of the city changed from the frantic shouts of soldiers to the slow, heavy footfalls of citizens walking the perimeter, searching for cracks in the stone or missed scraps of food. Winter brought a biting, damp cold that seeped through the thickest walls. Fires were kept small to conserve wood, casting long, flickering shadows against the interior stone. Every morning, the sun rose over the encampment of the enemy, a constant, silent reminder that the world outside had continued while time inside had stopped. 3 years began to bleed together. The walls held, but the people inside were being hollowed out, day by day, grain by grain, as the empire waited for the inevitable collapse of the spirit. The rhythm of the siege changed at dawn. The steady, patient thudding of the past 3 years erupted into a violent, synchronized roar. The Assyrians rolled their heavy siege towers forward, the ground trembling under the weight of iron-reinforced wood. A massive ram, tipped with a sharpened bronze head, slammed into the base of the northern bastion. The sound was not a strike. It was a bone-deep groan of rock grinding against rock. Dust began to pour from the mortar joints like gray snow. The defenders on the battlements staggered as the masonry beneath them buckled. Another strike. The main gate frame twisted, the massive timber beams screaming as they snapped under the lateral force. A hairline fracture raced up the center of the wall, splitting the solid stone from foundation to parapet. Then, the center gave way. A thunderous, suffocating crash roared through the city as the wall folded inward, burying the inner courtyards under thousands of tons of rubble. The sky vanished behind a thick, choking veil of pulverized limestone and smoke. The barrier that had stood for generations was gone, leaving only a jagged, smoking breach wide enough for an army to march through. The breach was still settling when Sargon II rode through the pulverized remains of the northern gateway. Where Shalmaneser had waited, Sargon moved with the finality of an executioner. He did not look at the ruin as a tragedy. He looked at it as a ledger to be balanced. Soldiers fanned out, clearing the palace complexes and the storehouses, moving with the cold precision of an empire that had already claimed the land. There was no resistance left to meet them. Sargon stood in the center of the broken courtyard, his presence a dark contrast to the dust-choked air. He ordered the scribes to document the scale of the victory, the number of captives, and the total annihilation of the city's defenses. Months later, in the royal city of Khorsabad, master stonemasons began the work of immortalizing the day. They hammered the story into the palace walls, carving the siege, the surrender, and the deportation of the tribes into deep, sharp relief. Every line of the stone depicted the end of an era. The northern kingdom was no longer a state, but a subject of the empire, its history stripped from the land and trapped forever within the unyielding rock of the conqueror's monument. The soldiers finished their work, but the true weight of the fall settled on the land like a suffocating shroud. It was not merely the loss of stone walls or palace wealth that signaled the end. The ancient record speaks of a deeper, more devastating severance. The text declares that the Lord removed Israel from his sight. This was the true catastrophe.
The divine presence of God that had anchored the nation through centuries of trial had simply withdrawn. The people stood amidst the debris of their homes, suddenly realizing the silence was absolute. There was no longer any intervention to break the cycle of suffering. Every prayer sent toward the empty altars at Dan and Bethel fell back into the dust.
The political reality of the Assyrian yoke was now matched by a profound spiritual exile.
The heavens remained closed. The covenant had been shredded, not by the invaders, but by the weight of their own history. The people looked at the landscape that had been their heritage, but the familiar hills no longer acknowledged them. They were a nation abandoned, adrift in a world where their only protector had turned away.
The physical defeat was merely the echo of a much darker, irrevocable departure. The order was absolute. Thousands of families were pulled from their homes, their possessions left to rot in the streets. Guards moved through the districts, herding the survivors toward the central square. The air was thick with the sound of weeping and the heavy iron of marching orders. Men, women, and children were gathered into long, winding columns that stretched beyond the broken city walls. This was not a migration, it was a systematic erasure. At the city gates, the soldiers forced a final separation.
Those who lingered were struck down, their bodies left in the dirt as a warning to the rest.
The sight of the city skyline fading behind them marked the death of their ancestral identity. They walked in silence, a vast, broken line of humanity moving toward an unknown horizon. The loss was total.
Every step taken away from their fields and shrines was a step deeper into the void. They turned their heads back one last time,
watching the smoke rise from the homes they would never see again. The nation was being dismantled, person by person, stripped of their land and their past. They moved forward not as a kingdom, but as a sea of captives, bound by the chains of an empire that demanded their total displacement. The march toward the eastern horizon began under a sun that offered no mercy. Thousands of feet kicked up a choking cloud of dust that coated every throat and eye. Ahead, the road stretched into the parched landscape, a path toward the distant regions of Hala and Habor. The Assyrian guards moved along the flanks, their presence a constant pressure that kept the column moving even as exhaustion took hold. Children stumbled,
their hands gripped by parents who could no longer offer comfort. Water was scarce, rationed strictly by the captors.
By the second day, the physical struggle became the only reality. The land they traversed was foreign, stripped of the familiar markers of their homeland. Every mile covered was a final tear in the fabric of their sovereign existence. The silence of the captives was heavy, punctuated only by the rhythmic thud of boots on hard earth and the occasional sharp command of the guards. They were moving into a void. History would record their departure, but the trail they blazed led into a silence that would last for millennia. As the sun dipped, the column pressed on, leaving the last vestiges of their kingdom to fade into the dust behind them. They were no longer a nation, but a people drifting into the shadows of an enduring mystery. Back in the northern highlands, the silence was absolute. The hearths were cold. The fields, once tended by generations, lay fallow under the sun. In the settlements, the evidence of a distinct culture began to disappear. Archaeologists digging through the layers of the earth find the proof of this sudden collapse. Where there was once local pottery, marked by specific regional styles and techniques, a new, foreign material culture appears. The transition is abrupt. The tools, the storage jars, and the construction methods shift within a single generation to match the standardized patterns of the empire. It is a physical record of erasure. The unique signatures of the northern tribes vanish from the archaeological record, replaced by the crushing uniformity of the conquerors. Houses were repurposed or leveled, their foundations buried under the debris of a new, imposed order. Every artifact tells the same story. A people stripped of their heritage, their craftsmanship silenced, and their traditions systematically overwritten. The land itself had been scrubbed clean of their identity. By the time the next season of rain arrived, the physical markers of their existence had been effectively deleted from the landscape. The kingdom was not just defeated. It was being unmade piece by piece, replaced by the alien influence of the new masters. The journey ended not in freedom, but in the heart of the Assyrian state. Here, the captives were processed like inventory. Scribes sat at portable desks in the shadow of massive city gates, their reeds stylely pressing into wet clay tablets with rhythmic, mechanical precision. Every name was etched, every family unit categorized, and every skill set noted for future labor. These cuneiform records remain today, cold and unyielding, confirming the systematic relocation of thousands to the imperial center. The bureaucracy was absolute. There was no room for individual narrative in these archives. There was only the tally of workers, craftsmen, and soldiers now bound to the service of the state.
The captives watched as their names were transcribed into an alien script.
A final act of transformation. They were no longer citizens of a northern kingdom, but assets to be deployed across the empire. The records detail their placement in Hala, Habor, and the cities of the Medes,
scattering them across a vast landscape to ensure they could never coalesce again. Each tablet serves as a timestamp of their erasure.
The empire functioned by this logic: to move, to record, and to absorb. By the time the ink dried on these tablets,
the people had been effectively severed from their past, locked permanently into the machinery of their captors.
The archives closed, the ink hardened, and the people vanished. In the pages of the biblical account, the narrative focus shifts entirely to the southern kingdom of Judah. The northern tribes, once the core of a sovereign nation, simply cease to exist in the written record. There are no more reports of their kings, no more accounts of their prophets, and no more mention of their cities. The silence is absolute. It is a sudden, jarring disconnection that leaves a permanent fracture in the historical timeline. This absence is the crucible in which the legend of the lost tribes was forged. Where the records end, the mystery begins. The absence of documentation creates a haunting void, a space where history stops and speculation takes root. For centuries, this lack of information has fueled questions that refuse to go away. What happened to a people who were once so prominent, yet are now defined by their disappearance? The void is not merely an absence of facts, it is an active presence, a weight that presses against the foundations of history. The tribes were not just deported, they were unwritten, erased from the collective memory of the ancient world. This silence transformed them from a living, breathing population into an enduring, spectral enigma that continues to echo through the ages. The silence left by the deportation triggered a different kind of pursuit. Modern scholars now treat this period as a vast, fragmented detective story. The primary question remains: did the tribes evaporate into the surrounding cultures, or did they retain a hidden, distinct identity? One school of thought argues for total assimilation. They point to the inevitable pressures of the Assyrian state, where language, religious practice, and social norms were forcibly reshaped to mirror the empire. Under this view, the tribes did not disappear, they were simply absorbed into the fabric of the Mesopotamian world. Yet, a conflicting theory persists. It suggests that collective memory and ancestral law provided a protective barrier, allowing the exiles to maintain secret traditions beneath the surface of their daily lives. Evidence is parsed from every available scrap of data, from private seals found in the region to the names preserved in local records. Each discovery acts as a piece of a larger, incomplete puzzle. The debate is not merely academic, it is a search for the mechanics of cultural survival. Scholars cross-reference cuneiform evidence with later historical accounts, looking for inconsistencies that might betray a hidden lineage. The investigation is relentless, transforming the void of the past into a field of active inquiry, where every archaeological site potentially holds a clue to their ultimate fate. The investigation pushes beyond the borders of Mesopotamia, following the ancient arteries of the Silk Road. Researchers now map linguistic remnants and cultural shifts that appear, like breadcrumbs, across the vast landscape of the East. This is no longer a search for a single location, but a pursuit of patterns across continents. In remote valleys and along forgotten trade routes, scholars catalog anomalies in local dialects and ancestral practices. These fragments often mirror the laws and traditions of the northern tribes, suggesting a long, arduous migration. Every mountain pass and river crossing is examined for evidence of a population on the move. The search is fueled by the persistent hope that the missing tribes did not simply vanish into the earth. It is an expansive, grueling process of cross-referencing ancient texts with modern geographic data. As researchers move further along the eastward path, the evidence becomes more fragmented, yet more compelling. They track the movement of specific craft techniques, religious motifs, and social structures that deviate from local norms. Each discovery serves as a potential anchor, pulling the narrative of the lost tribes across the map. The journey spans thousands of miles, turning the search into a modern odyssey that seeks to reconnect the broken pieces of a displaced people. The trail of the lost tribes narrows as we arrive in the heart of modern-day Iraq. Here, the investigation shifts from broad geographic patterns to the precision of the archive. Excavators working in the shadow of ancient mounds have unearthed thousands of cuneiform tablets, each a ledger of the Assyrian state. These small, sun-baked clay fragments contain more than just bureaucratic tallies. They hold the names of the deported. Scholars brush away layers of dust to reveal lists of individuals assigned to state service, their names bearing the distinctive phonetic markers of Hebrew origin. This is the moment the abstract history becomes undeniably personal. We see the names of farmers, craftsmen, and heads of households, recorded in the very tongue of their captors. Each tablet functions as a silent witness, documenting the integration of these people into the machinery of the empire. The clay does not lie. It confirms the presence of the northern tribes in the core of Assyria, working the fields and maintaining the infrastructure of the state that dismantled their homes. These records are the only surviving voices of a displaced population. They provide a final, concrete anchor in the historical record, mapping the exact point where a nation was transformed into a scattered workforce, forever changing the trajectory of their descendants. The focus now pulls back from the clay tablets to the wider lens of human history. Displacement is not a relic of 722 BC. It is a defining, recurring pulse in the human story. Across the globe, millions currently stand where those northern tribes once stood, stripped of their ancestral lands and forced to navigate the complexities of life in foreign territories. We see the same patterns of adaptation, the same silent efforts to carry memory across borders, and the same desperate search for a place to call home. The fall of the Northern Kingdom serves as a primary template for this universal experience. When we look at the ruins of Samaria, we are not just observing an ancient archaeological site. We are witnessing the physical manifestation of a people whose lives were irrevocably altered by external force. This history mirrors the contemporary reality of those who leave their past behind, carrying only their names and their stories into an uncertain future. The enigma of the lost tribes becomes a mirror for our own time, reflecting the resilience required to survive when the foundations of identity are shaken. We trace their path, not only to understand what happened to them, but to recognize the enduring, fundamental drive to persist when everything else has been taken away. How does a nation vanish without leaving a trace, and yet remain a subject of inquiry 3 millennia later? The answer lies in the mechanics of cultural survival. When physical borders fall, identity retreats into the sanctuary of the mind and the ritual.
For the northern tribes, the preservation of ancestral law acted as a silent,
invisible barrier against total assimilation. They did not merely survive as individuals. They carried the legal and moral frameworks of their ancestors into every new land they occupied. We see this pattern in the deliberate transmission of oral traditions and the insistence on maintaining distinct communal practices within foreign societies. Memory functions here as a form of architecture. It replaces the stone fortifications of Samaria with a structure built of shared history and collective commitment. Time cannot erase an identity that is actively rehearsed, taught, and passed from one generation to the next. The endurance of these tribes proves that identity is not tethered to a specific geography, but to the persistence of the narrative. Even when the cities turned to dust and the records were scattered, the core of their story remained intact. It is this refusal to forget that transforms a history of defeat into an enduring legacy, ensuring that the identity of these people remains a living, breathing force despite the centuries of exile. The wind moves through the broken limestone pillars of Samaria, the only remaining sentinels of a fallen kingdom. Here, the physical evidence of 930 BC meets the silence of centuries. We walk along the foundations of palaces once layered with ivory, now weathered by exposure and time. Archaeology provides the frame, mapping the walls and the debris of a collapsed civilization, yet the stones themselves remain mute. They confirm the scale of the destruction but cannot speak to the soul of the displaced. For that,
We return to the biblical core. It is this account that anchors the history,
providing the context for why these people were removed and where their memory persists. The ruins today are not merely a site of loss. They serve as a monument to an eternal enigma. We leave this place with the realization that some stories are not defined by their ending, but by their refusal to disappear. The mystery of the 10 tribes is not a puzzle to be solved, but a narrative that continues to resonate across the ages. History records the fall of a city, but the story of the people remains, etched into the foundational texts of human civilization, waiting to be rediscovered by every generation that looks back to the source. Their fate remains one of history's greatest unanswered questions. Please like, share, and subscribe for more biblical documentaries.